right, welcome everyone. We'll encourage you to keep your audio on mute just so that we don't have a lot of feedback and noise. But welcome, thanks for making time to join us. Allow me to quickly introduce Tommy, who is the president and founder of Resource Global. And I want to give him just a chance to tell us a little bit more about Resource Global, which is so dear to his heart. I think he's the best person. He's always the best person to introduce Resource Global to us because it's so passionate when it comes from him. So I want to just give Tommy a chance to let us know just a little bit about Resource Global and what we do.
My friend, thank you. Hey, good evening, everyone. For me, good afternoon from Chicago. I have gotten a chance to visit your wonderful, wonderful city on numerous occasions. Love what the Lord is doing and the growth when they call it Nairobi, the Silicon Valley of Africa. It truly is the Silicon Valley of Africa, and what you guys are doing is wonderful. Let me share a little bit about Resource Global. It is a global network of young Christian marketplace leaders in their mid-20s to their mid-30s who love the Lord, who want to be able to integrate their faith into their work. How do we begin to build where we learn from each other around the world, because the world is so small right now with the advance of technology? And how does a person from Nairobi learn from someone from Chicago? How does someone from Chicago learn from someone like you? Or how do we learn from someone in Singapore or South Africa or Austin, Texas? How do entrepreneurs, how do people in the finance, how do people in the corporations, startups, family businesses learn from one another, men and women? How do we begin to integrate our faith in what we do all the time? And I hope, especially with the leadership in Wangi, you will hear from people like Shundrawn, and every single month, we're going to get together every single month and hear from someone different. Later on this month, we're actually going to hear from Tony Bancroft, who is the lead animator for Space Jam 2 for Warner Brothers. And before that, he worked as a lead animator for Disney. How, as an animator, do you integrate your faith in all that you do? And I hope that you're going to listen to those stories, and we're going to hear from you guys as well, too. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Tommy. So without taking too much time today, we are super excited to have Shundrawn Thomas with us, just being able to hear his story, being able to learn from him. And Shundrawn is the president of North Trust Asset Management, which is $1 trillion global investment management business, and is a management group member of a leading financial services company. But beyond that, he's also engaged in a lot of civic leadership, serving as a trustee at Wheaton College and as a board director of the Museum of Science and Industry. He's a motivational speaker, a lecturer, speaking nationally in topics including professional development, leadership, values, faith, strategy, finance. He's an author as well of books like, Ridiculous Faith and Driving Under the Influence. And so we're super excited to have him with us, to be able to just hear from his story. I recently completed his book on joy at work and enjoyed going through that. And so we are super excited to have him and hear from him on the topic on joy at work. And so I just want to hand it over to Shundrawn. Welcome, Shundrawn.
Well, thank you, Mwangi. I really appreciate that warm introduction. I'm going to have to get you to bat leadoff for me in other places that I'm going, because I love when the person that precedes you brings passion and energy into the virtual room. So first of all, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to spend some time sharing about something that's near and dear to my heart. The way that we've decided to approach this, what I'm going to do is I'll spend some time up front, call it first 25 minutes or so, with some observations constructed around the concept of the book and the theme of the book. And I think it's something that I believe it knows no boundaries or no borders or no time frame. Because when you think about work, what I'd like to say is, if you're a person of faith, you can appreciate this. It is interesting, the opening narrative of the Bible. I like to tell people, if you think about it in this respect, when you read the opening account of Genesis, what do you find? You do not find a God at rest, but you actually find a God at work. God is actively, and he is busily, and he is joyfully engaged in work. And you know, in my opinion, that you can associate joy with God's work, because it tells us as he moves through the different stages of the recreation of the earth, because he says when the Spirit was first there, it was void, it was without form, there was work to be done. And every time God moves his work product forward, he pauses to reflect or take in his work. And he says, that's good. And it tells me that there is not only purposefulness, that work is part of God's character, right? But there is a joyfulness in what he does, right? The other thing that I would note as it pertains to work is that when we think about mankind, right? When we first see mankind created, they not only are to be fruitful and multiply and all these things, but even when we see their introduction, the man is introduced and planted in the garden to work and take care of it. So he's introduced into work. So work is a constant theme throughout the Bible. Now, this thought of discover joy in work, if I were to present to you and offer to you, and I see there are things that are coming up that are suggesting that we change the view. I'm going to tell you guys in advance, I'm not managing the view. So Tommy, I'll leave that to you fine folks if you want to change the view to speaker view or anything like that. But what I would say on this concept of joy in work in the book is woven, right, around three important words. I have already established the first, but those words are work, joy, and transform. All right. Work, joy, and transform. Now, as I get into unpacking this, I want to start so that we have a common vernacular or lexicon. I want to give you basic definitions for these three all important words that form the book, that form the theme of the book. And what I'm going to say is when I introduce each of the words, right, there is also a fundamental truth that I want to share with you. That's as important as it pertains to these words. Now, the first word, work, right? Work is mental or physical effort, and it's done in order to achieve a specific result. So work is not something that is hapless. There is an intended outcome or a result, and we exert mental, physical effort to achieve that result. Now, here's the thing that I want you to know. If you're doing work, any work that you do, any honest work you do, this is the fundamental truth that I want you to know. Work is inherently good. Work is inherently good. And we, as God's creations, are designed to flourish in our workplace. I'm going to come back to that. But I want to establish that first truth, that work is inherently good. And we are designed to actually flourish in our workplace. All right. Number two, what's the second word? The second word is joy. And it's interesting because a lot of people hear the word joy and their reaction is they don't associate joy with work. For some reason in their minds, they think these are strange bedfellows. But what I want to say, first of all, as far as the definition, joy is something that we would consider a source of great pleasure or delight or think about fulfillment, things that give us joy. I like to say to people, joy is not in and of itself simply a feeling, but joy in its truest sense is an attitude of the heart. Right? And the thing that I want you to know as it pertains to work is this fundamental truth. Work is intended to be joyful. Work is intended to be joyful. So work in its proper form, in its perfected form, is not something that was intended or is intended by God to be a burden, but it is designed, it is intended to be joyful. Now, the final word, and this is important, is transform. And what does transform mean? Transform means to change from one thing to another. You can think changing from one state to another, right? And the thing that I want to establish as far as the truth as it pertains to this third word, transform, is that for all of us and for any of us to experience joy in our work, we must transform our mindset. The Bible tells us this powerful truth that how we are transformed, how? By the renewing of our mind. So transformation, spiritual transformation, that impacts every area of our life is not something outside of us that happens to us. It's something that occurs in us through the power and the grace of God. And so if I want to actually experience this kind of fulfillment that I speak of, this joy that we find in our work, we have to transform our mindset. And in particular, we have to transform our mindset about three things. We have to transform our mindset about, number one, the workplace. Number two, something that I call work ethic. And then number three, what I will refer to as our work life. Now, the book Discover Joy in Work is set up in 3 segments, and it addresses each of these things: workplace, work ethic, and work life. And now I'll use that as the opportunity to then take you through what I would call my Reader's Digest version of covering joy in work. And we'll go through those 3 segments. Now, let's start with your workplace. And the way that I want to approach it is we'll talk about each of these. We'll talk about what it means. If you don't mind, I'd like to share with you an anecdote or a story, because I think sometimes we can bring to life understanding of concepts with stories. And I have some true stories that I think will be helpful in doing that. And I also want to intersect some empirical research. That's what the book does. The book not only gives experiences from the lives of real people, anecdotes or stories, but it also gives empirical research to get at this concept of discovering a joy in work. Now, the first thing we said that we have to transform is we have to transform our view of the workplace. So what is the workplace? Now, your workplace is simply this. Your workplace is the environment in and the community with whom you work. Your workplace is simply the environment in and the community with whom you work, right? Now, what I find is interesting about work, if you ask people how they feel about work, I want you to test this. When you have some time this week, ask people, whether they think about their work or their job. And what you're going to find is more than not, they won't respond to you about their job content, what they actually do as far as their work. They'll often respond to you about their workplace, how they feel about the people that they work with or the environment that they work in, right? And that's why that's the first thing I want to address. Now, as stories go, people have likely heard the parable of the sower. And I think the parable of the sower is interesting, right? It tells us there was a farmer, in a sense, who goes out to sow seed. And the sowing of this seed is indiscriminate. It tells us that the seed lands in different places. It says some of it lands on the path and it's trampled over. Some lands on stony ground. Some of it lands among thickets and thorns, right? And some of it lands on what is referred to as good ground, right? And I could go through the spiritual meaning of all those things, but I want to pull this component out. What's interesting is if you go back and you look at the parable, even though the growth that comes forth doesn't persist in all places, it persists only in the good ground, all of the areas actually, to some degree, bring forth life. There is some form of growth. It doesn't always persist. And so what it means is the proverbial different kinds of ground, all in some form or fashion, had the potential to bring forth that plant life, right? And so the ground in the parable of the sower is a metaphor for our hearts. But because metaphors can take on different meanings, what I want to tell you is the ground, as you might think of it, can also be thought of as our workplace. And so when you go to your workplace, not your proverbial, your very real workplace, you are sowing your time and your talent into the workplace. It can be various forms of sowing. And what happens is a lot of people look at the workplace and they say, well, there are these problems. I don't like the people I work with, or I don't feel, appropriately, valued for what I do. There are lots of different things. But what I want to suggest is if we start with the focus on what our mindset is and how we can transform our mindset, because what I like to tell people is our workplace is not a proverbial paradise. But just like the Garden of Eden that had to be worked, all workplaces have what I call paradise potential. They have paradise potential. And so the potential and how you experience your workplace, whether or not you flourish, believe it, more than not, is a function of how we see and experience our workplace, and not so much always what is happening to us, right? I want to share with you this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes as it pertains to work. Earl Nightingale says this, very powerful. He says, "We are at our very best and our happiest when we are fully engaged in work we enjoy on the journey toward the goal we established for ourselves." He says this, listen to this. "It gives meaning to our time off and comfort to our sleep." Now that's good work. And it says, "It makes everything else in life so wonderful, so worthwhile." And so the way that I talk about this in the book is, if you were to go through the first segment of the book, there's a construct that's referred to as the 4 A's. And in the 4 A's, what I talk about is, number 1, attitude, number 2, approach, number 3, aptitude, and number 4, achievement. So attitude is simply the way that we think about our workplace, right? And again, I want to encourage you that we all have the ability to change our attitude and to reframe the way that we see our workplace, and thus actually have more success and flourish in the workplace. Number 2 is approach. And so we spend a lot of time talking about how we engage our work and the people that we work with. So changing our approach can give us more fulfillment in our work. And we talk about aptitude, the capacity that we have to learn to do. Here's the thing. There's no such thing as competence or aptitude being fixed. So being made in the image of likeness of God, it means that we have the ability to continually grow our capacity to learn and do. And when I talk about attitude in the book, we go in depth about discovering, developing, and deploying our aptitude, both our innate abilities and our developed skills. And then finally, there's achievement, attaining a goal or desired outcome. What I like to say there is, activity is not synonymous with work. So just because you're busy doesn't mean you're getting any work done. Work is only being performed, right, when we actually are accomplishing the outcomes or doing productive things. And so the reality is, some people are not fulfilled in their work because they're not getting a lot done. Now, on this thing of workplace, what's interesting and sort of a powerful piece of research is, there's an outfit, Gallup, that for years has been doing, studies on what they call engagement in the workplace. And then what engagement means is people that are A, passionate about their work, and B, committed to their employer or their workplace. And you know what they find? If you look at this globally, they say somewhere in the neighborhood of only about 14% of people globally are actually engaged. They would consider themselves engaged in their work. That's 1 out of every 7 people. So what that means is there's something about what's going on in the workplace that the vast majority of people, on average, it would suggest 6 out of the 7 people that you run into are not engaged. They're not feeling fulfilled in their work. And that's why I think this thing about transforming our perspective, our view of the workplace is the place where we need to start. Now, there's a second thing that we address in the second segment of the book, Discover Joy in Work, which is your work ethic. So the second segment talks about work ethic. So what is work ethic, right? So work ethic, I would simply define it as this. It's the principal belief that work is intrinsically virtuous and builds character, all right? Now, here's the thing. There's another parable in the Bible. Maybe I'm sure you've probably come across this one. And it's called the parable of the vineyard. And in the parable of the vineyard, what we find is there's a major local employer. It's someone who, among other wealth that he has, he owns a vineyard. And it says, because it's an agrarian society and many of the jobs have to do with some way or another cultivating the land or working the land, he's a pretty important employer. And so for his vineyard, he would regularly go out and hire day laborers. And so one morning he goes out to hire laborers for the vineyard, and he agrees with them if they will come. Now they're unemployed, effectively. But he agrees to pay them a full day's wage, one denarii, a full day's wage. And so they agree and they go and they work. Now, subsequently, he sees others that are unemployed, right? And so it says he goes out at noon and he invites them also to work in his vineyard. Now, the invitation is a little different at this point. It says that he invites them to come work in his vineyard, and he agrees that he will just pay them what is appropriate at the end of the day. So he does this at noon, he does this again in the mid-afternoon, and finally he does this again in the evening. So 4 different times he creates opportunities for those that are unemployed to come and work in his vineyard. And it says at the end of this day, he goes to pay those workers who had worked in his vineyard. And the interesting thing that he does is he actually pays those who had started last first. And it says that those who had started last, even though they had come towards the very end of the shift, so to speak, in the evening, he paid them 1 denarii, one full day's wage. And he does the same thing with those who would come in the mid-afternoon, those who would come at noon, and those who had come in the morning. Now listen to this. It says those who had come first, those who had come in the morning, they were upset with the vineyard owner because they would assume that because they, quote unquote, worked the entire day, that they would get paid more, even though he paid them exactly what he agreed to pay them. And so he says something interesting to them. He says, "Why are you upset with me because I am choosing to do good?" Now, here's why I tell you that story. What does that have to do with work ethic? If we say work ethic is the principal belief that work is intrinsically virtuous, that it actually builds character, it means that the value of work goes beyond, listen to this, what you get paid. And the problem with most people's mindset, is the common carnal mindset, is that work means I exchange my time for pay. But work in its orientation was never assumed to be just that. Yes, work is a means by which we earn a living, but it is so much more than that, right? And so, one of the things that we find is when we look at surveys, we've done some survey work. Now, this is particular to the US, but you would see this commonly among workers all around the world. And so they do what's called a wasting time in work survey. So they interview not only hiring managers, but they also interview employees. And what they find is that a full 3/4 of all workers admit to wasting 2 or more hours a day at work. Now, what's interesting is when you delve further in these interviews and the research, and you talk to individuals, you say, why is that the case? Some of them say, they don't feel appreciated or valued in their work. They're not appropriately challenged. They feel sometimes burned out. There are a variety of ways that account for the distractions or the disengagement with work. But what it also tells you is that they're not receiving the full value, and they're not feeling value in the work experience. And it brings me to an interesting quote by Elbert Hubbard. And he says this: "We work to become, not to acquire." I want to say that again. We work to become, not to acquire. And so that gets at this thought again of work ethic. So one of the things we talk about in the second segment of the book, one of the things I write about is these 3 common external rewards that people typically look to, Tommy. And they are what I call the 3 R's. These 3 rewards: remuneration, recognition, and respect. And here's the truth. Inherently, none of these are inherently bad. Remuneration means pay for work or service. So I meet very few people, almost none, that actually want to work and not get paid for it. So it's not inherently bad. Recognition, it means affirmation for others. And respect, it means esteem or regard based on achievement. You think of like in workplaces, many times people can get status or titles. But here's the issue. When we focus on the external rewards solely, or when our external rewards outstrip our internal rewards, we don't really have a true work ethic. And only when we get to the point where our internal motivation is greater than our desire for external rewards can we get to the point where we have a true and a genuine work ethic, and we can come to actually fully appreciate, value, and get the true fulfillment and joy out of our work. Right? Now, again, somebody asked, what was the quote? It's, we work to become, not to acquire. Now, the last segment of the book is entitled Your Work Life, your work life. Now, when I say work life, what am I referring to? When I say work life, listen to this, I'm referring to the time, talent, and effort you devote to your vocational journey. I'm saying that on purpose because work life is not about just your present job. You are on a life journey, and if you're working, you generally have a career, so you'll transition through various roles and responsibilities, right? And this is your what I call vocational journey, right? And what's interesting is if we think about, some of the research behind this, the typical workday accounts for over 50% of waking hours. And for many people, because they commute to and from work in some form or fashion, less in the virtual age, and certainly sometimes less given the nature of the pandemic we're experiencing now. But there are also things that people do associated with their work that go beyond just their direct job responsibilities, which means that we find on average people spend about 2/3 of their waking hours committed to their profession or their work. Now, how do we think about, work life? There's one more parable I want to share, and this may be a very familiar one to some. It's the parable of the talents. And in the parable of the talents, it says there was a nobleman who entrusted his servants with his wealth. It says this nobleman was going away to receive a kingdom, and he was going to return. And so this is very important because a lot of times when people read this particular parable in the Bible, they leave out some very important parts of it that are essential to the understanding. Because it says he distributes to his servants according to their ability. That's an important understanding. So when he gives one 5 talents, he gives one 2, and he gives one 1 talent, he's not doing that just indiscriminately. It actually says very clearly he's distributing to them based on their ability, right? Now, he tells them very clearly that he expects them to actually use this wealth and to earn a return on it. And so it says he goes away and he comes back, and when he returns, the first servant comes and he's turned his 5 talents into 10. It says the second one comes and he's turned his 2 talents into 4. This is great. And it says finally there's the last servant. And the last servant comes and he says, I'm sorry. Effectively, he's saying, I know that you charged me with taking this wealth and being productive with it. But I knew you had high expectations and you were a hard man. So what I did is I just took that talent and I hid it. It says that the nobleman, and in the parable, the nobleman represents Christ. He calls him a wicked and a slothful servant. He said that at the very least, you could have actually put it with bankers or investors and gotten some sort of return on the investment. And it says, while he receives positively the first 2, the other is cast away, right? So what does that have to do with our work life? What I want to suggest to you is work is so much more than something that we do as a means to provide for us. God is constantly working with us, and every single one of us are becoming. And if we are truly followers of Christ, what we are becoming is like him. We are being formed into the image and likeness of God. And God uses every aspect of our lives, including and especially our work, to form us into his image and likeness. It would be very inefficient if the only time God was working on us was during worship service on Sunday. And so this shows through the parable where the nobleman represents Christ is very present in our work. His kingdom domain has to be a part of what we're doing. And one of the ways that we most emulate Christ, right, is through the kingdom of God being realized in our lives and through our works. And that means that we are to be careful stewards. We are to be productive. We are to be excellent at what we do. We are to, in our work, find the purposes of God. And we are to reflect God in the way that we do our work and in the way that we serve others. And that's why it's true from this quote from Rumi that says, everyone has been made for some particular work. And the desire for that work has been put in every heart, right? This is truly God at work. And so finally, what I would offer to you is 7 principles. And I will end with these. These are the principles that are laid forth in the third and final segment. And the principles are to reinforce a concept that I have there, which is work-life synergy, that our work is not separate from our lives. And in fact, I don't even believe in the concept of work-life balance. I don't believe that my work I'm trying to balance with my life, but I believe that I have one life. And my work is to be integrated in my life. It is to be wholly consistent with the will and the way of God for my life. And so the 7 principles are: number 1, work reveals purpose. Work reveals purpose, right? You can work for a company that has a mission, but you have to find your personal mandate. Number 2, work requires effort, right? We established what the definition of work is. You have to put forth physical, mental, and spiritual effort to achieve your work. Number 3, work promotes growth. If you commit to work, what you will find is you will develop professionally and you will mature personally. Number 4, work develops skill. Just because you have some innate ability or some acquired skill, you want and need to turn that into mastery. So work develops your skill, right? We said number 5 is work fosters relationships. The number, the diversity, and the quality of your relationships are expanded when you do good work. Number 6, work produces value. If you're working, right, it's not just activity. There are benefits, there are services, there is increased utility. It is discernible and it is measurable. Work produces value. And then finally, work glorifies God. There is a transcendent purpose beyond just earning a living. We are image bearers made in the image and likeness of God. And so our work, when we do it to the glory of God, glorifies God. And so with that, I'm delighted to engage and answer any questions that you have. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you about the book.
Thank you so much, Shundrawn. I'll continue encouraging all of us. If you have any questions, please feel free to send it to us on chat. Thanks for taking us through that. I mean, I'm impressed at how you were able to summarize the book that took me so long to read into such a short snippet. But a few questions have come in that I want to throw your way.
Sure.
I just want you to tie in a little bit more about what you talked about, the concept of, I mean, I think everyone in the world talks about work-life balance, work-rest balance, versus work-life synergy, etc. I mean, there are so many terms that are used. How do you reconcile this, and how does that practically look like for you in your day-to-day? How does this tie in with your family, the rest of your life and your work?
Yeah. So I appreciate that people ask this question. You know, I used to think myself, because like what I was introduced to coming up, like, so first of all, I started out the business. I've worked most of my career in financial services. I started out working for, now my work life began, to be quite frank, when I was really small, right? So I didn't grow up. I did not come from a well-to-do background. I have wonderful parents who established me in my faith and they're my greatest role models. But I'm not in any way ashamed to say, I mean, we struggled financially. And so my orientation from work started when I was, 11, 12 and started just figuring out, small jobs to do to help with the family, whether it was, cutting lawns or shoveling snow or washing cars. It didn't matter what it was, right? And I worked through high school. But my first, sort of full-time employment was working actually with an investment firm. I worked for an investment banking firm, Morgan Stanley. And I worked all the time, right? It was just the nature of the business was we worked a lot of hours, right? And I remember as I progressed through my career, you would hear to your question about this concept of, especially as you make life decisions, I got married, work-life balance. My wife and I are both working these demanding careers. And what I realized is I understand the spirit of what people are talking about, because what they're really saying is, for many people, work takes on the dominant role in their lives. And the risk is work, if not approached the right way, can become an idol to itself. And so what they're trying to figure out is, how do I manage my work with respect to and in relation to the other things that are important to me and priorities in my life? Because work is one of them. It should not be the only one. But what I found is, I don't think there's really a true such thing as work-life balance. I find that as people think about it, there are seasons and times that you're going to go through. And there's no perfect stasis that you find. There's no such thing as, I say, I have my work on this side of the scale and I have the rest of my life on the other, and there's some kind of way I can weigh them or balance them. What really you have to be able to do is you have to have a clear sense of priorities and values. And that's why the Bible says, when it says you can't serve God and money, it's not saying that you shouldn't pay attention to money, but it says very clearly in that same stanza, seek first the kingdom. And so what I really think that we need is what I refer to as this work-life synergy. The synergy can only come if you have principles that are guiding you. So those principles say, what are the priorities in my life? And what happens from time to time for all of us is things will get hectic. Sometimes things will go, quote unquote, out of balance, right? But if we have the right kind of prioritization and we know what our values are, our deeply held personal beliefs, you know what we'll do? We'll adjust. What we will also do that's more importantly than in that even is, over time, we will choose to pursue vocations and even the very places that we work that align with who we are and what our values are, such that there's a good cultural fit for us, and so that we don't feel this tension. And that's what I describe as that work-life synergy. And so the last thing I'll say there, some people are just working in environments that aren't well suited for them. They're working in cultures where the values don't align with the things that they most prize. You'll never find or feel a sense of balance if that's your scenario.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Shundrawn. And just tied to what you're saying, so if someone is in such a toxic workspace, initially you talked about, and in the book you also talk about the fact that a lot of our ability to find joy comes from the change of our own heart, mindset, attitude, etc. But can you reach a point where you cannot find joy in a particular workplace? Is there an environment where it gets impossible?
Right. So let me go over a couple of scenarios. Number one, if you let's be clear, I don't have a Pollyanna view of the world. For some people, there are environments where, unfortunately, say the people who lead the organization or manage the organization, they have created an unhealthy work environment. There are issues of discrimination or prejudice or sexism or any of these things. Let me be clear. There is no amount of changing of attitude that changes those inequities or those cancers. So if someone is in a workplace like that, my view is they should make every effort to make a change in that environment, because that's just not a healthy environment, and that's nothing that God desires for any of his children. Now, there's a practical reality that it may take some time to make that transition or whatever what somebody's working through. But that never would suggest that you shouldn't have that desire. God places good desires in our hearts, and God cares for us. And so I think that that's something we can see. What I would say to you, Mwangi, though, is that's usually going to be a small percentage of people. So now what about the rest of people? So for the rest of people, there are a couple of things. For some people, if you really look at it, the place that we work, they don't really change dramatically. They change in sort of slow, predictable ways. And so what often really is changing is us. So here's what you have to think about sometimes. Sometimes I really do believe life is time and seasons, right? And so you could be in a season of your life where you have a desire for certain things that you want to do personally and professionally, and you can be in an environment that fits you and suits you very well. And say, for instance, that season changes. Say, for instance, you believe that God has a call on your life to do something very specific. Think about, I'll give a dramatic example, not that we will all have these. God tells Abraham, you know what, leave your family and your kindred and your place and go here. You got to leave that job, right? My point is sometimes we can be in a place and nothing's wrong with the place, but there may be some things that are changing in our lives to have that synergy that might call about a change. So that's a scenario. The most common scenario for many people is we actually really just need to change our attitude. You can really tell how your day is going to go almost before you show up. We are decidedly creatures of habit. Do you know we make thousands of decisions a day and we don't cognitively think about them? So most people think intellectually we're thinking about. What happens is we've already formed views of the people that we work with. And so how we're going to respond to the situation is like hard-coded in, right? We act more out of what's called our emotional or our limbic brain than we do out of our cognitive brain, right? And so the reality is the resetting of ourselves, this transformation of our mind, and that's why spiritual disciplines are so important. You actually do have to work hard to learn how to love people the way God intends. In our sin nature, I can assure you it does not simply come to us naturally. And who more than you need to love than the people at work that you spend most of your waking hours with? So that's some of the things that I would share on that.
Wow. Thanks. Another question that's coming, Shundrawn, is the area of finding joy in work tied to your gifting and your basically your gifting and your calling? So one, is the level of joy I'll find tied to how gifted I am for the role I'm doing? And two, is it a particular job I was called for that will allow me to experience that kind of joy?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. I would tell you my view on this will differ from some others. Some people espouse to this thought that there's some perfect job we're called to. And so when we find that job, right, then we'll be happy or joyful. I just fundamentally don't think that's true. And the reason I don't think it's true is because there's actually nothing that I see. People are called to certain ministries in the Bible, but we can't misapply that to like the work that we do. So we can look at the ministry that Paul had, but his profession, he was a tent maker, right? There's nothing that I read about Paul that says God specifically said as a profession, he had to be a tent maker. He has a calling to what he does in ministry. I think vocation is a calling, but let me tell you what it is. It's not so much you are called to it. It's more so how do you feel about what you have chosen to follow? Do you know, as professions go, if you look back in history in terms of vocation, if you go back hundreds of years ago, everyone who committed themselves to or chose a vocation viewed it as their call. I want you to get that. It wasn't they found something that they were especially chosen for. It was they chose a vocation and then they viewed it as a calling. Are you following me? And so what I believe that is true is this. Now, here's what I would say to you. It is actually very important to understand your talents and your gifts. Let me explain why. Because most jobs, quote unquote, and I don't like the word job, I prefer to use work or vocation, but most professions or work that you're called, that you feel, in a sense, a call to, even if you don't initially feel that, the reality is they can be done in different ways. Do you know that there could be 100 people who have the same role that I have, but none of them do it the way that I do? And the way that I do it is a function of my understanding of myself, my particular skills, and my talent. So that's where that comes in. So what I do, here's the way I like to say it. I tell everybody, make the job you have yours. Do it like nobody else but you can do it. And that'll be really joyful. Now, if you try to do your job like somebody else who doesn't have the same temperament, experience, gifts, capabilities you are, you might not like that much. But I work hard to make every role that I have unique to me.
Sorry, I was on. Thanks. The questions are still coming in a lot. We'll see what we'll be able to cover within the time we had today. For those who are sending questions, if we don't get to yours, you'll forgive us. We'll see what we'll be able to cover. So, tied to that, to what you're saying still, is it possible that I would feel a dream that God has given me for my life being different from what I'm working in and what I'm doing? And how do I pursue work and that dream for God separately? How does one go about discovering what God may be calling me to, yet it may be separate from work? Right. And like for you, I know you're both a pastor and in the corporate space. How does all that work out for you?
So I'm so glad that you asked that question, because a lot of times people have, in a sense, artificial constraints that either they place on themselves or have been placed on them by others. So you know what? From when I was really young, I loved reading and writing, and I particularly loved writing. And nobody ever told me when I was young, right, that I could pursue like writing as a profession. It was like, work hard, get an education, get a good job. Now, it turns out that I found that I really like business, and in particular, investments and finance. And that's something that I feel especially skilled at in those things. But you know what? It was some years into my career, I had never lost this desire about writing. And in fact, I would always find excuses to write, whether it was marketing materials, things like even at work. And so finally, at one point, I just felt a special unction from God to write. And that's and this was in the early 2000s, and that's when I wrote my first book. And since then, I've written 4 books. My point is, what I choose to do professionally doesn't constrain God's plan for my life. It doesn't constrain the dreams or the visions that I have. I have to decide how I use my time. Now, listen, and I don't mean this in any disparaging way. I tell people there are always trade-offs. Like, because people will say to me, how are you so engaged in your church and you serve in a role as associate pastor, and then you have a demanding job and you write? I said, well, you see what I, in a sense, do. You don't see what I don't do. So I virtually don't watch any television. I'm not very compelled by it. But I also don't have the time for it, right? Golf is a really interesting game that a lot of my friends play, and I don't have 5 hours to commit to running around chasing a small ball. It's not bad or good, but my point is, God gives us an incredible, amazing form of grace if we choose to receive it from Him. And so we are many times only constrained by the capacity of our own mind.
Wow. Thanks. I think we'll take one last question and see where we are with that. So if we take all these things and open up, what you're saying, remove the constraints and be able to see just how much we can be able to do in terms of what we're passionate about, our day-to-day work, etc. How do you handle burnout? How do you handle genuine fatigue? People are always talking about burnout in this day and age. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because let me be clear. It doesn't matter if you are a believer, you have a relationship, all of us, right, can experience like burnout. And what I realize, usually when I'm running into those kind of issues, here's what I realize. It really usually means that I've kind of, in some ways or another, lost sight a bit of the priorities, or gotten a little pressed as far as an area that's an important value to me. And so it's usually what that means is it's an opportunity to reset. And usually, let me make it very practical for you. Resetting is virtually almost about how you're spending your time. And it doesn't mean that it even has to be a dramatic shift in time. Let me give you a simple example. There are people in all of our lives, right, who in effect give us positive energy. And there's people in our lives that in a sense draw energy from us, right? And so one of the things that we have to do is think about how we're spending our time and who we're surrounding ourselves with. And sometimes I've realized for myself, oh, I get it. The reason I feel burnout is because I'm not spending enough time with those people who can speak life. You ever been around people and their nature is they're highly critical? It says the power of life and what? Death are in what? Our tongue. So I said, okay, I need to just think about how I'm spending my time and who I'm spending my time with. Sometimes I realize that in my best efforts, while I know it's important to seek the kingdom first, I've gotten a little too caught up in whatever I'm pursuing in the context of the world. And I have to pause and say, this has got to take a little bit of a back seat. I have to pause and say, I've got to spend more time praying. But those are the things that change that sense of burnout, because God's spirit is alive and well. It's vitality. And every time we plug into it, we get that power boost. But if we're away from it, we feel drained, because ultimately what it's saying, and I end with this, it's when I don't realize that I am now leaning to my own understanding or working in my own strength. When we get to those points, we will experience burnout. But whenever I am focused and looking to God as the guiding light and seeking God for wisdom, when I'm plugged into the Spirit, my energy is limitless and boundless.
Final one.
Sure.
How have you managed to integrate your faith in your workplace? How have you managed to see it as a ministry space? I mean, you still have your church ministry, but as you said, you spend more than 50% of your waking time at work. What does that look like for you? How would you encourage people to view their work as their ministry space?
Yeah. So the thing is, to me, it goes back to this work-life synergy in part, right? I'm not a Christian or a believer on Sunday. I'm a disciple of Christ every day, every moment. The kingdom of God is a real and present reality, right? Jesus said over 2,000 years ago, the kingdom of God has arrived, right? And so I believe that. And so what does that mean to your question? It means that God's word has to inform what I do. So when I make decisions, my decisions are made based on the principles of the Bible. I don't make decisions different at work than I make at home. It means when I think about how I engage with and treat people, because so many people, they have this risk if they live their life with a dissonance. They're believers, but they somehow say, I'm not going to necessarily use the truths or the wisdom of the Bible to guide the decisions that I make at work. I'll do it outside of that. But that by definition, in a sense, means not to be a believer. It by definition means not to be transformed. But when you do that, what will happen is this. It's what the Bible says when it says this. It says, we're like cities placed on top of a hill. It says we're supposed to be the light of the world. And what does it say about a light? It wasn't made to be put under a bushel. It was only made to be seen. And how can people see Christ in our lives except not so much about us preaching? I'm not talking about you got to walk around handing out tracts to the people that you work with. It's literally them seeing that the thing that you're committed to, you profess, is just evident in how you live your life and how you treat people and how you make decisions. And that peculiar, exciting, tremendous, transformative life that is in your life is seen by others. And you know what happens? there will be people in your life that will come to know what is driving you to make those decisions. Why do you have joy when others don't seem to? How could you be so confident and to stand on your truth, even though it was inconvenient? And that becomes the tremendous moment where you can share about Christ.
Thank you so much, Shundrawn. It's been amazing just having you here for this short period. We hope that when this pandemic clears, you'll manage to take a trip to Nairobi and we'll be able to maybe have another session with you. But thank you so much just for availing your time out of your schedule to just share this amazing insights with us, and God bless you for that.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yes. To the rest of us, thank you for joining us this evening. It's been a joy. It's been amazing. There will be a follow-up email that will be sent to all of you, so please look out for that. On that email, there will be details of how you can catch this video. We'll have recorded it. We'll put it up so that people can still watch. I know some of the things for those of you who may have been trying to take notes may have passed. So there'll be a chance to be able to catch up with the video and just listen to it again. But we'll be having another session with another speaker next month as well. And that'll be Catherine Alstoff on September the 16th. So again, look out for our email with details on that. Look out for the WhatsApp messages on the social media pages, etc. Details for that. I'll encourage all of you to follow our Facebook page so that you can be able to get more details. And that's at Resourcer Global, so that you can be able to get more details on any events that we may be having. Yes, but feel free to contact us if you have any questions, more questions. If you'd like to know more about our events and what we're doing, feel free to get in touch with us. Feel free to go on our website. There's lots more details there, Resource Global. And thank you for being able to join with us today, and looking forward to being with you in the next events coming up. Anything you'd like to add, Tommy, as we close?
No, it was a pleasure. And Shundrawn, thank you so much for taking time out from work to do this.
Thank you to all of you. Wonderful seeing you. Until next time, have yourselves a good evening.
Good night.